So the next stage of the camisole neckline with bust dart gathers is we're going to face our outer piece with our facing and insert our strap. So the strap should be the half left over from your sample, and we've got a point here where our strap is going to go. If this wasn't obvious, you would probably need to notch it when you did your pattern making. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pin that in place so it is perpendicular to the top of my camisole. And then I'm going to put the facing on top of that and stitch it using a 1 centimeter seam. If you wanted to, you could pin this, but I personally don't like pinning. I feel like it's a bit of a waste of time and it makes everything take a lot longer than it should. So to begin, line it up with your 1 centimeter line, do your reverse stitch, line up your raw edges, and follow the shape of your camisole neckline. Now I'm just coming up to my strap and I've got a pin in there, so I'm going to use the hand wheel, keeping in line with the shape of my camisole neckline. So there's a little area where you'll have to turn a corner. I can then take that pin out. I left it in there and used the hand wheel just in case it moved if I took the pin out before that. And then you can finish off that straight edge, and of course a little reverse stitch. Now here we've got the strap, you can see it through there. Just need to reinforce that with a reverse stitch over the top. Now what we're going to do is we're going to clip and notch. Just turn that. Our camisole neckline, so we can turn this out easier. Okay, because you've got all this seam allowance here. Once folded, it's going to want to fit in here. Straight edge, we don't need a clip and notch, but around a strap, we should. So we're going to cut out little triangles around that strap, and then for our curve, which goes under the armpit, we're going to clip and notch that as well. So now we should be able to turn that out a lot easier because we've clipped it and we've got a concave curve here. So these curves, that curve inwards, definitely need to be clipped and notched, otherwise it won't sit flat. Now for our facing, we need to do an understitch, which what that does is it stitches the seam allowance to the side of the facing to stop it from rolling out when it's worn. You don't want the facing to roll out. So the way we do that is, so this is my facing, this is my outer fabric, and I need that seam allowance to sit towards the facing. So I pop my foot down, making sure that's nice and flat and open. I can feel the seam allowance, making sure it's on the right side. And I'm going to, so the understitch should be quite narrow, so 2 millimeters roughly from the seam line. So I can line up the seam line with this part of the presser foot. So it's just a couple millimeters away from the middle edge of the presser foot. So a little reverse, and what you need to do is make sure that seam allowance is facing the right way, but also that is nice and wide and flat and open, okay? So as you go along, you're going to use your hands to check the seam allowance is in the right position, so on the facing side, and make sure that seam is nice and open. Here, I should actually be able to stitch all the way through. If this was pointed, you'd have to stop, do a reverse, and start again over here. But I reckon I can go all the way through. I've just got to make sure that seam stays nice and open. So that's my understitch, and the role of the understitch is to keep the facing from rolling out. So that's what it would look like. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do those gathering stitches here, and I'm going to gather this off camera because I've already shown you how to do it here in part 1, but I'm going to do it off camera and get that organized. Okay, so I've got my gathers done on my facing piece. Now just a reminder that when you do gather, it needs to be on the longer stitch length but now what I'm going to do, which is a little bit different, I'm going to put it back to 2.5 and I'm going to stitch these in place. So I'm going to use the hand wheel to go over my pin. Do a little reverse, and I'm going to stitch these in place because I need to overlock this edge. But before I can do that, I need to make sure my gathers are going to stay in place. Just finish with a little reverse. Right, so I can take my pins out. My stitch line should stay, and then what you need to do is you need to overlock this edge, and then we're going to iron it and finish it with a ditch stitch. Now one thing I didn't mention is, of course, when you gathered this, you should have double checked with your notches to make sure that you gathered it enough. Okay, so that's a good fit. Now what we're going to do is we're going to iron our neckline on our camisole. And then what we're going to do, so we have our facing here, we're going to iron this seam allowance upwards. So using the iron as an anchor, you tug fabric above to get a nice open seam. So that's what I mean, it's nice and open. So now this part should fit in with 1 centimetre roughly overlapping. And we're going to finish it off. We've got a couple things to do. We've got 2 things to do, a ditch stitch, and then we unpick this thread that we can see. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay this out flat, and we're going to pin our facing. Now remember, you've ironed that seam allowance upwards. We're going to pin our facing to our outer fabric, making sure this is all sitting flat, and again our notches should line up, which I check before and they do. So I'm going to do this side, making sure it's all flat. The seam allowances line up, and then I'll just do one in the middle. So you really have to make sure that sits flat. So what we're going to do is a ditch stitch to secure our facing in place. And what a ditch stitch is, it's a stitch in the ditch of a seam join. So here, so we line up the etch on our presser foot with that seam and we stitch in the ditch. Now I've got a couple pins in there, so I need to make sure I don't sew over them. I'm going to use my hand wheel to go over them. I could have pinned them the other way, but it's easy to pin this way. And as you go, you make sure it's flat, and you should be able to feel roughly about 1 centimetre of that facing overhanging here, the seam allowance. So what the ditch stitch does, it creates a way to secure the facing when you have a seam that runs horizontal, and it also becomes an invisible stitch. So if I used a cream, the same colour as a calico, and stitched in there, you wouldn't notice it because people would notice the seam more than the stitch line. So again, I've got a pin coming up. So I'm going to slow down and use my hand wheel. Keeping my seam nice and flat and open. Again, slow down for the pin, use your hand wheel. So that is the ditch stitch. Now if you hold that far away, I mean you can see it because it's pink, but you wouldn't actually be able to see it if it was the right colour. Take my pins out. And then the last step is to unpick. I would get rid of these big fluffy bits. But from this side, all you have to do is unpick that stitch line, the gathering line that you can see. So I'll do that now. Okay, so that is my finished camisole neckline with bust gathers. Now it gives you a subtle shape, the bust gathers. Strap, understitch, facing, and a ditch stitch to keep that facing in place. Now the ditch stitch with the facing is pretty much a requirement for anything that's going to have a horizontal seam like an empire line or a waist seam. It's the best way to get it finished. It has a seamless finish, and what I mean by that is there's no stitch line, so it's a nice clean finish. So that's that.